Okay. I wanted to, I'm going to kick this meeting off and then hand it off to the moderator. So I wanted to welcome everybody. I'm Kathy Jones, president of the League of Women Voters of Alabama, and we're having another in a series of our environmental somehow I muted myself. I'm not sure how that happened, but all right. So I wanted to.
That's my fault. Sorry.
Oh, it's no problem. So I'm going to just start over. So I wanted to. My name is Kathy Jones, League of Women Voters of Alabama state president, and I wanted to welcome you to our next in a series of environmental education series. We're having a lot of different topics, and we try to explore and help people understand the connection to the problems that Alabamians are facing and how it relates to voting, because that's really what people need to understand, is that they need to be engaged and actually show up and vote. And tonight we're going to, in continuance of a recognition of Earth Day, we are having our program tonight is related to climate change in Alabama, and then it's going to look at some of the renewable energy solutions that are available. And I wanted to hand it off to Cindy Lowry, who will introduce our two speakers. And as you go through this, if you have a topic that you want to ask a question, if you will go ahead and drop it in the chat, Cindy will be watching it and we'll help her if she wants us to keep straight on those too. So this will be a great presentation, and thank you all for attending tonight. Cindy, I'm gonna hand it to you now.
All right, thank you, Kathy. Hello, everyone. I'm Cindy Lowry. I'm the Vice President of the Board of the League of Women Voters of Greater Birmingham, and honored to be moderating tonight. And since we're talking about the environment, I'll also just add my day job as the Director of the Alabama Rivers Alliance, a statewide environmental organization. And I have the privilege of introducing two of the most knowledgeable people in the state on this topic these topics we're talking about tonight. So this is going to be great to hear from Dr. R. Scott Duncan, who Scott holds a BS in biology from Eckerd College and an MS and a PhD in zoology from the University of Florida. He is currently a professor of biology at Birmingham Southern College and the former chair of the biology department. As well as many other accolades. Scott has written many peer-reviewed science journal articles and co-authored others. And he is one of my favorite books to share. He's the author of Southern Wonder, Alabama's Surprising Biodiversity, which actually has a foreword written by Dr. Edward O. Wilson, another recently deceased wonderful biologist in Alabama. So we're super excited to have Scott talk to us tonight. And then our second speaker of the night will be Daniel Tate. Daniel is the Executive Director of Energy Alabama, which is a nonprofit organization advancing Alabama's transition to sustainable energy through education and advocacy. Daniel also has accolades. He is the 2015 International Young Energy Professional of the Year by the Association of Energy Engineers and is a certified energy manager. He graduated from the University of Alabama in Huntsville with a degree in international trade and foreign language, and he currently lives in Huntsville. So these guys are going to wow you. These gentlemen are going to wow you, and I will let, we're going to start with Scott. And yes, please put your questions in the chat. We'll monitor those throughout. We're going to leave most of the questions to the end. If there is a really pressing, clarifying question, I'll try to break in and ask that, but otherwise we'll leave questions till the end. Scott, we'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Cindy, for that introduction. And thank you to everyone being here tonight. It's a privilege to speak to this group. It's a very important group, and certainly at a very crucial time for people's engagement on many different issues, including and especially the environment. Let me get set up here, sharing screen. And you should, can I get a thumbs up from Cindy if you're seeing my full PowerPoint? Okay, cool. All right, so again, thank you everyone for being here tonight. Before I jump into the talk too much, a couple of ways to keep track of me and some of the writings and some of the ideas that I'll be sharing with you tonight. Cindy mentioned my book, Southern Wonder, from the University of Alabama Press. I also have a blog at scottduncan.me, and I write about issues from climate change to biodiversity and things, everything in between. Have an Instagram account, and also have a new book that should be coming out in early 2023 called Creeks to Coast, about restoring the rivers at the heart of America's freshwater biodiversity. So I'll have this slide at the end, and you could take your phone and take a picture of it if you wanted to, because that's a lot of information to try to remember. Well, let's get started here. I think that when I usually speak to the public, it's often about biodiversity in the state. I've made it one of my life missions to try to make sure everybody knows how important Alabama is in terms of its biodiversity. And recently, I redid the analyses of state rankings and found that we moved up from position 5 to position 4. We have more species in almost every other state in the US. Only 3 states are ahead of us. And so these results came out a year ago, February. But I most recently did a reanalysis of some of these statistics. And of the top 12 states for biodiversity, Alabama ranks #1 when you look at biodiversity per square mile. So in terms of that top tier, we are certainly #1 in terms of the density of species per area. Now, with great nature comes great responsibility. And unfortunately, we're falling down on the job. We've lost many species in Alabama, species that you see pictured here, from fishes to birds to aquatic species like mussels. And if you look at our rankings in terms of other states, we actually rank #2 for the total number of species that have gone extinct. Hawaii is a special case because islands are particularly vulnerable to extinction. So on the continent, we are ranked #1 for extinct species, and by a wide margin. And we're not out of the woods yet. In fact, we have many species that are still facing extinction. This is not a problem of our past. If we look at the number of species that are protected by the Endangered Species Act, we rank #3 for those federally endangered and threatened species. And it's unfortunately, in a generation, we could lose dozens to hundreds of species that are only found in Alabama or mainly found in Alabama. That's what's at stake here. Now, this is not just an Alabama problem. This is a global problem. This is the biodiversity crisis. We are seeing high extinction rates around the world. And in fact, recent reports are indicating that if we continue with the business as usual practices of fossil fuel consumption and deforestation, by the end of this century, 1 million species will be at risk of extinction, if not already extinct. So that's what's on the line here. Now, this is more than just sort of sad footnotes about the progress of humanity, because this biodiversity is critical to our survival. The last couple of decades of ecological science research has shown the many ways that we are wholly and completely dependent on our ecosystems for our very survival. We can categorize these in what are called ecosystem services, which you see in this pie chart here. And the ecosystem services range from economic to regulating to ecological to cultural. And the particular services include things like the provisioning of water and food, or more abstract but also important things like tourism and health and well-being. I like to pull out the pollination tab. 75% of the food species we rely on, the plant species that we rely on, depend on wild pollinators to do the pollination. People can't go out in fields with Q-tips and pollinate all the crops without there being mass starvation. And honeybees alone are not up to it either. So these are wild pollinators that depend on ecosystems. So we are completely dependent on nature for our survival, even though it often doesn't feel like it. Now, in addition to that, what we've learned is that healthy ecosystems provide more ecosystem services, these things that keep us alive and healthy. And here's the connection with biodiversity. The more native species in our ecosystems, the more and better services those ecosystems provide. So all those bugs and fungi and critters that are out there, they actually are doing important things to help us have a healthy life and our capacity to thrive. The threats to biodiversity are so severe that the World Economic Forum in their 2022 report ranked biodiversity loss as the third most severe risk to humanity over the next 10 years. The World Economic Forum is an international organization that engages top thinkers in a range of areas from politics to business to culture and gathers their ideas about how to shape the agenda for the planet in terms of business as well as in terms of governance. So biodiversity is so important and so at risk that it ranks number 3. Now you've probably noticed what ranks number 2, which is climate action failure. That's failure to act on climate change, and extreme weather, which of course is also intimately tied to climate change. So now I'm going to flip and start talking about the climate crisis, because the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis go hand in hand, as you'll see as we proceed here. Now, I want to walk you through some of the just basic fundamentals about climate change, what we're seeing and what are its causes. I know you've heard and seen this in different ways, but it's always good for an update and good to see these data in some different ways to continue our education. What we're looking at here is a timeline. So on the horizontal axis of this graph, we see a timeline from 1880, which is the time of the invention of the mercury thermometer, up to the year 2020. And what we're seeing on the vertical axis here is a temperature change. And specifically, we're looking at deviation from the average temperature over the 20th century. So that's what that horizontal line through the middle of the graph represents, the average temperature for the past century. The bars, whether they're red or blue and above or below the graph, represent yearly average temperatures for the planet in terms of their deviation from the average temperature. And what you can see pretty clearly is that during the first half of the 20th century, temperatures were below average. And then ever since about 1980, we were looking at temperatures that are well above average. And you'll also notice that the peaks of those bars get higher and higher over time. So the bottom line is that temperatures are rising very quickly globally, and we've actually already raised temperatures 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, on a typical day in Alabama, we're jumping like well over 10 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes 20 or 30 or more, it seems like. And so it begs the question, well, is 2 degrees Fahrenheit that big of a deal? It is. In fact, the way to think about it is not like a daily temperature change. Think about it more like having a fever. 98.6 is the average body temperature for most people. If your temperature was up a degree or 2, you would feel it, your body would be achy, you would have loss of appetite, you would have brain fog. Now imagine like every year goes on, your temperature raises up just another half or tenth of a degree for the rest of your life. You're gonna have a pretty miserable time. That's a much better analogy for thinking about whether 2 degrees Fahrenheit is a lot or a little. Now let's ask the question, why are we warming? Several decades of science has nailed this down very firmly. There are 2 causes of global warming. The first and biggest cause is heat trapping gases accumulating in the atmosphere from fossil fuel use. That accounts for 75% of the warming that we've seen thus far. The other 25% comes from deforestation. Deforestation, of course, liberates the carbon locked up in trees, just not only their canopy and their trunks, but also their roots. It also liberates the carbon that's trapped in the soils. And that all that carbon winds up in the atmosphere. And so that's the 25% right there. You can see how carefully atmospheric carbon dioxide tracks the warming temperatures. That's what that gray line is that goes across the graph from the bottom left to the upper right. The vertical axis on the far right shows you the concentration of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the years. So this is our smoking gun. The carbon dioxide levels are rising and we're to blame. Now, I want to show you another graph that's kind of similar. It's also a timeline like we saw before, but this timeline actually stretches back 500 million years. So you are at the far right. We're at the far right of the timeline. And are you guys still hearing me? I got an unstable connection warning.
Yes, you're good. There was a person off mute that's now muted, so that might have
Okay.
interfered a little.
Okay, thanks. There's probably problems on my end too. So, okay, so this is a timeline, and the squiggly lines across the timeline show average global temperature. This is from geologic data. And what I want you to notice first off is that Earth's climate varies. It varies from being very hot to very cold. And in this case, that horizontal line that you see across the middle of the graph represents the average temperature between 1960 and 1990. Okay. And what you see is that we've had many times when temperatures have been above that average and many times in Earth's history when it's below. Now, pay attention over here at the far right. I want you to notice where I've got that big arrow pointing. That is the beginning of the most recent time period that we're in geologically. It's called the Holocene, and it's lasted about 10,000 years. And during that time, our climate for the planet has been exceptionally and unusually stable. And this stability is what allowed humanity to develop the cultures that we have today, to develop civilization. For the major reason for that being that we were able to master agriculture in many places around the world. And with agriculture, a more sedentary existence, and with the abundance of food, there was the diversification of skill sets, and that all led to cities, city-states, nations, and so forth that we have today. The scary thing, though, is that if you look at the far right of the graph, if you look at where those two red dots are, the bottom red dot represents 2050. And just below that, you'll see the tip of a little blue line. That's where we are right now with our temperature. We have actually left our safe climate window. We are no longer in the stable pattern of climate from the Holocene. That means we are in uncharted territory for humanity. We've never seen this before as a civilized species with the richness of culture that we have today. And that's what has so many of us quite concerned. All right, so let's move on now to ask this question. How is climate change affecting Alabama and the Southeast? For many years, scientists were telling us, climate scientists were telling us, and I taught my students, I was like, well, climate change will affect things sometime down the line, probably when you're much older than you are today. Well, this is one place where climate change scientists were a bit off target because climate change has been hitting us hard and fast these last few years, as I think most of you are aware. Here in Alabama specifically, we've actually seen an increase in temperature in the last few decades. What you're looking at here is a graph from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The horizontal axis is the timeline from 1960 to the year 2022. And the horizontal line across the center of the graph is the average from 1901 to the year 2000. And what we see here is the blue line that's kind of smoothing out of those data. And you see that our temperature here in Alabama, our average yearly temperature has increased 3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1960. Other states have actually warmed a lot more. Most other states have warmed a lot more. We've been lucky, we haven't seen quite as much heating. So what are the consequences of this warming? Well, one of the most scary of these are heat waves, because heat waves do a lot of economic damage to agriculture, and they put a lot of people at risk of hospitalization and even death. Heat waves there's actually a terrible heat wave hitting India and Pakistan right now. And we don't yet know how much the casualties will be, but they're going to be pretty high. And it's only April, which is we haven't even entered the warm season for those countries yet. Okay, so what are we seeing here in the Southeast in terms of heat waves? Well, these graphs that I'm going to show you of the lower 48 states show red circles that indicate the degree of the heat wave, because you can measure heat waves in different ways. This first graph that I've got here, this map is showing change in the number of heat waves per year. And you see that over this time period, Alabama has seen an increase in the number of heat waves of about 4 to 6 per year over background levels for most of the 20th century. Another way to measure heat waves is to look at how long they last, their duration. And what we see here is that heat waves in Alabama are now lasting about 2 to 3 days longer on average than they used to. Another way of measuring heat waves is to look at the range of the time of the year, the warm season during which heat waves occur. And in this case, we're seeing an extension of about, I think if I'm reading that correctly, of about 50 to 75 days of the calendar year that we now get heat waves, whereas before it was a much narrower window. The one bit of silver lining here is that the intensity of the heat waves, how hot it actually gets during a heat wave, that hasn't actually shifted upwards. So yay for that. But we're getting hammered in some other ways with our heat waves. Now, this is a trend that's going to continue. In fact, a recent scientific study came out looking at what are called intergenerational inequities and exposure to climate extremes. And the quote from the paper is that children born in 2020 will experience a 2 to 7-fold increase in extreme events, particularly heat waves, compared to people born in 1960. And this is under the current climate pledges by nations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we're headed for more of this, unfortunately. Now, along with the rising temperatures, we wind up having changes in the availability of water, even here in the Southeast, where for much of the year we have a lot of water. The reason for this is that as the atmosphere warms, it holds more moisture. So it's the atmosphere, think of it as a sponge, and it's able to sponge up more water after rainfall events from just the surface, but also from the soil. Also, with the increased temperatures, you get more evaporation, and you also get a speeding up of photosynthesis, and all of that adds more water to the atmosphere than before. So even in some years, we're getting more rainfall than we used to. That water is very quickly going into the atmosphere, which means that we have less water for everything from agriculture to drinking water supplies to water in our streams and creeks for recreation and biodiversity. Now we've been, I want to keep talking here about hot conditions. And one of the things that comes along with heat waves and stuff is also droughts. Alabama is prone to droughts as are other states in the Southeast. And this one in particular hit us in 2016 and lasted all the way into 2017. This is the fifth of the 5 droughts that we've had since the year 2000. And this was devastating to agriculture. Many communities were struggling to find enough water that they could afford to buy when they had to buy it from neighboring water districts. And of course, it was devastating on our creeks and rivers in terms of biodiversity. So again, seeing the connections between biodiversity and climate here. Droughts are like this that hit hard and hit fast, like we saw in 2016, are exactly what has been predicted from the climate models for quite some time. Now, along with droughts and these heat waves, you come an increased chance of wildfire. We typically think of wildfires in the US, we think of the US West Coast, or maybe we reflect back to those pre-COVID days when Australia was on fire and how horrible those fires were. Well, the Southeast has a hot fire season as well during these dry periods. Fire is a natural force in the Southeastern landscape, a natural part of our ecosystems. But during these unusual dry periods that we're creating, these fires can actually do considerable damage to our ecosystems, unfortunately. And of course, threaten infrastructure and sometimes, kill people. People died in some of these fires. All right, I've been talking about hot, dry things. Let's now flip the script and talk about rainfall. Because climate change, most of the impacts of climate change are taking things that we're familiar with, like fires and heat waves, and then making them more extreme. And one of the things that we're seeing is a shift in rainfall patterns. Now, this graph that you see here shows average yearly rainfall from 1900 to the year 2022 in Alabama. There's been roughly a 5-inch increase in rain per year. And we're talking about a difference of like 55 to like 60 inches per year. That's not much at all. And climate scientists don't even talk about that as being related to climate change. All of this is to show that we have a slight increase for rainfall, but nothing dramatic. So I'm not trying to connect this to climate change. But what has changed is the way that the rainfall is coming down. Recall that I explained how the atmosphere holds a lot more moisture than it used to. Well, that means when it rains, we get dumped on a lot more than we used to. And we're seeing this with some devastating rainfall events on a regular basis now. I put this slide together and I was going to change it out for a more recent flood, but then I looked at the date. This was almost a year ago, May 4, 2021. Birmingham got about 8 inches of rain. Much of the area got about 5 to 6 inches of rain. Streets were flooded, businesses and homes and apartments were flooded. There were rescues that had to be performed by emergency personnel. Fortunately, I think in this flood, no one died. However, in just a couple months ago in March, we had a flood here in Birmingham and near my house in Highland Park, near St. Vincent's Hospital, the area over the road filled up like a lake, and the stormwater was so extreme, it actually swept a man off his feet. He was a patient that was being discharged from the hospital. He swept him off his feet and he drowned. So and this is not the first drowning from these kinds of floods. There's several every year for the last few years. So this is unfortunately part of our new normal. Now, flooding is also happening on the coast, but for different reasons. This is a picture from Chesapeake Bay area around Annapolis, Maryland. And this is due to sea level rise. The sea level is rising because of the meltwater from glaciers and ice sheets around the world. As temperatures rise, these ice masses are melting. And that's added about 8 inches of sea level rise to our oceans around the world since the year 1901. Unfortunately, that is already flooding some of our most low-lying areas. It's not on like a daily basis, but on those times when you get a particularly high tide, or you get winds that are blowing these high tides ashore, you get inland flooding. And unfortunately, flooding like that is going to become a regular thing, almost a daily basis thing for many communities along the northern Gulf Coast and the East Coast. And if we continue putting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at the same rate, the projections are that by the year 2100, we will see 7 feet of sea level rise over what we had in the year 1990 to the year 2000. So places like Dauphin Island and Gulf Shores, Alabama will not be the same as they are now. That is, you can say that with certainty. That is if we continue pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at the same rate we're doing right now. So what is our response to this? You're familiar, I think, with the Paris Accord. That is an international agreement for countries to voluntarily reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. It's the first successful of the international agreements on climate change. There's many different dimensions of it, and there's not enough time tonight to get into all of those. But suffice it to say that their goal has been set to try to keep warming below 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit or 1.5 degrees Celsius. Above that level, we are looking at levels of warming that can't be described other than being catastrophic in terms of its impact on people. Unfortunately, we've already seen globally about 2 degrees of Fahrenheit of warming on average when you look at the global average. So we don't have a lot of freeboard left in terms of carbon we can put in the atmosphere and how much more warming that we can endure without hitting those dangerous levels. Above this level of 1.5 degrees C or degrees Fahrenheit, we start hitting what are called tipping points. So what are tipping points? Tipping points are when small changes become significant enough to cause larger, more important changes. And there's about 9 of them that are already being pushed pretty hard by the climate change we're already seeing, and about another 9 or so that are on tap for later this century if we keep going. Some of these tipping points that we're already have engaged and may have already set into motion include the loss of the Amazon rainforest. Right now, the forest is getting drier and drier as the years go. It's a combination of global warming and deforestation. And it's basically headed towards becoming a tropical savanna ecosystem. Another one that's even scarier is the Greenland ice sheet. Some of the scientific estimates are now that the Greenland ice sheet will melt. We've already added enough carbon to the atmosphere that its melting is inevitable. That will add 23 feet of sea level rise to the world's oceans. Fortunately, if there is any fortunate to this, that will be spread out over several centuries, maybe millennia. So it's not like we're going to get 23 feet anytime soon. but Greenland is still going to be contributing several inches or more to sea level rise this century at the rate that it's melting. So these are what the tipping points are. Once you tip these planetary systems over the edge, there's no going back. We do not have the technology to bring things back. Even by reducing carbon levels in the atmosphere, it would not restore the Greenland ice sheet, for example, not for many, many thousands of years. So these are the tipping points that we're trying to avoid by keeping global warming below 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so if we want a future of peace, security, and prosperity, we must make climate a top priority, from international treaties to actions in our communities and daily lives. So what should our priorities be? How do we do this? Well, number one, we need to avoid the worst that climate change can bring. And of course, we do that by transitioning away from fossil fuels and towards clean, renewable energy. The other thing that we have to do is to adapt to the changes that are already here and those that are coming and that are unavoidable. For example, that means adapting the way we do agriculture, or adapting by changing how we live along the coast, as you see here at the bottom, rebuilding salt marshes and other ecosystems to help us with sea level rise. So those are what our top priorities should be. Now, an important question to ask is, can we do this in time? The scientists are saying that we need to reduce greenhouse gases sorry, let me restart there. Scientists are saying that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by mid-century, if not before, in order to stay below those targets that we see with the Paris Accord. And that means a significant reduction just in this decade, because we beyond that, it gets almost impossible to try to limit warming to keep it from getting catastrophic. So can we do this in time? And I think we can. And there's several things that make me think that we can. In fact, I would say we can, and we must, and we will. And here are the reasons that I'm optimistic on this. First of all, our science is strong. We know what's happening, why it's happening, and what the solutions are. Our science has never been stronger on this than it is today. It is very solidly giving us the predictions that are about how the Earth is changing and what we can expect in the future. What we're experiencing now is absolutely what was predicted in the past with climate models. It's just the only difference is that it hit us a lot sooner than the models had suggested. Another reason that we can do this is that clean energy technology is proven, and it's cheaper than energy from fossil fuels in most regions of the world, if not all. Other signs of progress is that global financial institutions are shifting their investments away from fossil fuels and into clean energy. They've seen the writing on the wall, and they're starting to invest in that future. And that's a good thing, because where the money goes, action follows. And of course, we got the 2015 Paris Accord, that international agreement. We're not doing the best of job of doing everything that we agreed to do back then. And by we, I mean the global we. But it certainly has led to some progress, some important progress thus far. And I also take hope in the fact that more Americans every year are realizing that we're facing a crisis because of the extreme weather events, and many of them want action. Right now, about 72% of Americans think that global warming is happening, and that number just keeps going up. So how do we respond to the biodiversity and climate crises? How do you and I, as just ordinary people, how do we deal with this? Well, I would say that the first thing we have to do is resist our instincts of denial, fear, distraction, and resignation. Those are psychological protection devices that we have ingrained in our brains when we're facing something big and scary. We have to resist that. And instead, we have to bravely face our reality with optimism and determination. And when we do that, it's at that moment that our lives pivot, when we reject a future of chaos and begin building the future that we want. So how do we get started with that? Well, we work as individuals, we work with the skills and the tools that we already have. So depending on whatever your life experiences are and whatever you have at your disposal, that's what you work with. And it also means that we have to be strategic about that. And by strategic, I mean three things. I mean, first of all, letting nature be our guide. Nature has lived in balance on this planet for quite some time. And the more that we study nature, as from a scientific perspective or otherwise, the more that we study nature, the more we learn about ways that we can live with nature and with each other in ways that are sustainable. Secondly, we need to work together. This is not the kind of problem that we can solve by just working on our own. We have to come together and work through collective action. That is critical to this success. And then finally, we have to scale up our impact. It's not enough to just be working on our own basis in our own yards, in our own lives. We have to scale up to the community, and communities have to scale up to the cities and cities to states. We have to get this happening at scale. Otherwise, we're going to miss these targets. Now, I want to wrap up here with a couple of concrete ideas about what these nature-based solutions are. Remember, that was the first of the 3 strategies that I just covered. One of the things that we must do is end deforestation, and that's from the Amazon all the way here to Alabama. Deforestation, to remind you, is contributing about 25% of global carbon emissions, and it's a leading cause of extinctions. So here's what we call multi-solving. When you solve one problem, you're solving another problem. So this is ending deforestation is good for biodiversity and the climate crisis, of course, because we need to keep that carbon in our forests. Another nature-based solution is planting trees. It seems too simple to be true, but it is. Trees are our best technology that we have right now for removing carbon from the atmosphere. We need to be planting trees everywhere we possibly can. Not just any tree, we got to choose the right tree for the right place, but we need those trees out there growing. Again, more multi-solving for biodiversity and the carbon crisis. Another one is greening our cities, and I mean this quite literally. Here you see a figure on the left of a city. This is from a study in Washington State. You see a community on the left with lots of trees, there's parks, there are riparian habitats, streamside habitats. And then on the right, we see a city that's gridded out and there's very little green there. Well, as it turns out, trees like those that you see on the left panel are nature's air conditioning units. As they do photosynthesis, they are moving heat from the landscape up into the atmosphere, which helps cool us down here at ground level. Unfortunately, neighborhoods that lack tree cover or much tree cover can be anywhere from 8 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit hotter in the summer. Here in Birmingham, it's about 8 degrees hotter in these communities. And because of a legacy of problems from systemic racism and bank lending and civic investment, the communities that tend to have a lot of tree cover are those that are wealthier and white, and those that tend to not have as much tree cover are communities of color. And those neglected communities are suffering a lot when we have those heat waves. Those are the folks that are most at risk for a variety of reasons, including this one. So we need to be literally greening our cities to protect ourselves. All right, other types of nature-based solutions. We need coastal restoration. The marshes and the reefs and the barrier islands that are being restored along our coasts are our first line of defense against sea level rise, and they help restore biodiversity. The picture that you see here on the right is of the largest restoration of salt marshes and oyster reefs that has ever happened in the Gulf of Mexico. And it was just completed recently by the Alabama chapter of the Nature Conservancy. I'm on their board, very proud to be on their board, and was thrilled to see just a few days ago that they won yet another award for this project. And other states are sending people here to see how this project was done because it was so successful. Another example of nature-based solutions is sustainable hydropower. And this is a very complex topic, and I don't have enough time to get into that. But parts of that that I think you can relate to would be the removal of old and dangerous dams that are on our rivers, dams that are no longer useful, but are actually hazards to people, and they're interrupting the flow of animals. And sorry about all the noises from my phone. They're interrupting the flow of animals and sediments in our rivers. So another part of this strategy is that at those dams that are going to stay in place, we need to improve the energy output of existing hydropower, at least until we get enough renewable clean energy from other sources. As we do that, we also need to make sure that fish and other animals are able to pass by these dams with the technologies we have, plus new technologies. And sediments need to move downstream as well, because the sediments are needed to restore those coastal ecosystems. All right, so that leads to our last of these nature-based solutions, which is harnessing clean energy, the energy that nature is providing to us from the sunlight and from wind. And Daniel's going to take it up from here. But one last opportunity here, you can take out your phones if you want and take a shot of these URLs if you'd like to follow up with me on and follow my blog, or to follow me on Instagram. And certainly reach out to me anytime at my email address, which I'll put in the chat shortly, which I don't have on here. But that's it. So I'm going to unshare my screen. And
thank you, Scott. That was wonderful. And we do have a couple of questions, but we're going to hold those till the end so that we can hear Daniel's presentation in its full entirety. And so, Daniel, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, folks, if someone give me a thumbs up that you see my slides, awesome. Thanks, Scott, appreciate that. And I appreciate all of y'all for joining us this evening. I'm Daniel Tate with Energy Alabama. I'll talk a little bit about renewable energy, energy storage, electric vehicles nationally, and also how things are happening in the South and specifically here in Alabama. I see some friendly faces here tonight, so some of y'all may have seen some of this, but I'm going to also add some new information and talk a little bit about things that are happening overseas right now that are making these pressures even more real for many of our friends in Europe, and we're also feeling a good bit of it here in the States. So let's get started. And I'll say also that I will make this presentation available, so if you have any questions about data sources, we'll look at charts, spreadsheets, if you're a nerd like me, I have plenty of links in the notes for you to dig as much as you possibly feel to your heart's content. So let's get started. The context, much like Scott mentioned, this is essentially where our emissions are coming from in the United States. This is a little bit older chart, a couple years old, but the trend still holds. And essentially, you can see that sometime about 2015, 2016, in the United States, because of rabble-rousers like me and many of the folks here on this call pushing for clean energy, emissions from the power sector have been declining. Now, of course, not nearly as fast as we need them to, but you can see that switchover, right, in 2015, 2016, where transportation actually has become our largest emitting sector of greenhouse gases in America. And when you look specifically at that transportation, that's what most of us, drive, our passenger vehicles, 18-wheelers, and then many other vehicles, of course, but those are much smaller portions of transportation emissions in the United States. Unfortunately, Alabama is not there, right? And we look at Alabama's emissions. This is from 2018. The 2020 data is now out. Preliminary data, I believe, but it's pretty close to this. So it hasn't changed dramatically since 2018 data. You can see that here, the vast majority of emissions generated in the state of Alabama still come from electric power. So what does that mean? Essentially, we have not made nearly as much progress as many of the other states around the country in driving down greenhouse gas emissions from the electric power sector, because we are still heavily reliant on coal and gas, and that's driven by our three main generators of electricity: Alabama Power, which is a subsidiary of Southern Company; Power South, which is a generation and transmission utility that sells to many electric cooperatives in the southern part of the state; and TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, that serves much of North Alabama and areas like Florence and Huntsville. Even if you don't believe in any of the stuff that Scott talked about, I hope that I can convince you that even for nothing else than raw economics and money, that this is the right thing to do. When you look at this chart, this is actually a pretty good think tank, Energy Innovation, looking at the cost of renewable energy compared to existing coal plants in the United States. These red dots that you see are essentially where existing coal plants are more expensive, 25%, and in some cases even more expensive to operate than closing them down, paying for the closure, paying to replace them with renewable energy, and operating the renewable energy. So let me pause there for a second and make sure you get that, right? This is not just, hey, we're going to put up some solar panels and wind turbines, but this is actually closing the existing plants, putting all of the stuff away, like the coal ash and things, responsibly, replacing the assets, and it is still cheaper. Okay. This is, operating a coal plant anywhere in these red areas is just an economic loser completely. If you're looking at things like methane gas, this is increasingly the case for methane gas. You're looking at what the CEP, that blue line, stands for a clean energy portfolio. A portfolio being things like energy efficiency, which can be responsive on the grid, demand response, shifting when we use power, things like renewable energy of all sorts. So a clean energy portfolio is looking at how do I use a variety of clean technologies to match the operating characteristics of a gas plant, right? And if you look at this line, you can see that, of course, as you have heard from Scott, and I'll show you some additional charts here shortly, clean energy technologies are dropping in cost very quickly. And so that's why you see this down trend on the CEP to the point to where it is actually cheaper today. If you are looking, if say you're a utility and you go out to the market and you want to buy a new power, it's cheaper to go and get clean energy than it is to build a new gas plant. Now, that doesn't mean that that's what always happens from utilities and regulators, but if we were making just a raw economic decision, gas would not be built. And you can see even under the current scenario that about 2030 to 2035, clean energy actually becomes cheaper to operate more so than even operating existing gas plants. Much like that chart we saw before with coal, all of a sudden you have those same red dots for all of the existing gas plants. Now, this chart is interesting in that it does not take into account the world that we are currently living in, right? All of those gas projections about how gas is cheap and it's going to be cheap forever because of the shale revolution. Well, a bunch of pesky folks like me have been saying for a long time, and before the Public Service Commission and other forums, that we were living in an aberration. Gas, as you see, natural gas prices have been very volatile over its history. This is a couple of charts, the second one down there going back to 1997 or so. You can see that gas has historically been a good bit more expensive and only in the very recent past been relatively cheap. But with things happening like supply chain issues and things in Ukraine and with Russia, you see massive spikes, this left one being natural gas future prices and the one on the right being the Henry Hub natural gas spot price. So all the things that we thought about this cheap natural gas aren't really the case. And many people are feeling this in their pocketbooks today when we think about inflation happening with electric and natural gas prices. This is what's driving it right here. When your utility bill from Alabama Power is higher this winter, it is because of rising natural gas prices and an over-reliance on natural gas. All right, so what do we have to do to try to solve some of these problems? This is my favorite slide because it's just a bunch of awesome people around the country sporting Energy Alabama merch that I randomly did a tweet one day and tons of people started saying, we love this and we're gonna wear hoodies and shirts to electrify everything. What do we mean when we say electrify everything? If you recall those lines on the chart, essentially what we mean is that we need all transportation to be electric. We need all industry to use electric processes. We need all of our buildings to be all electric. And then we need all of the electricity to run and be powered cleanly, right? So we need clean energy to be generated so that all of these processes can run on clean electricity. It is the one thing that we know how to make clean. Now, solar is not new. It's been around for quite some time. Many of you may have seen me with a slide like this. It's a little bit different type of solar, of course, harnessing the heat of the sun for hot water. But we have been playing around with different types of solar technology for many, many years. So anybody who tells you that solar does not work in Alabama apparently has never lived in Alabama for longer than a few days during the summer, because we have all felt the power of the sun, right? And as Scott mentioned, it's only getting more and more powerful. So a few trends I wanted to make sure that folks understand, at least nationally, that are happening with solar specifically. You can see this massive boost in the amount of solar installations happening across the country. As we install more solar, then of course the price, the economies of scale is coming down. And when we do that, we're also employing a lot more people, right? These are jobs that cannot be outsourced. These are jobs where people have to physically go out, install things, and maintain these projects. And you start to see here on this bar for 2018, a darker orange that's going to continue to grow over time. And that's operations and maintenance. As we get more and more renewable energy projects out there operating in the real world, we're going to need more and more people to make sure these are operating safely and productively for a very long time. So that's going to be an increasingly growing job sector. This is looking at the kind of growth forecast for solar in the United States. You can see a lot of it being driven by utilities. And when we say utilities, I won't be so naive as to say that they do this willingly. This is utility scale solar, often being driven by regulators or legislators in some way, putting in renewable portfolio standards or other policies that kind of force that we don't have a market, right? We kind of have one supplier, and it may be Alabama Power, it may be your local utility, but you got one supplier. And so you got to have a regulator or a public service commission to step in and kind of force some of these issues to happen. Solar pricing, even though we don't have nearly as much renewable energy online in Alabama as you see in many of our neighboring states or other areas around the country, has been declining in Alabama. So these are real world project prices based on a couple of studies that have been done by Savannah, I think it was Savannah River National Laboratory, as well as some projects that we have been a part of here in the state. So the prices are coming down. And batteries too, for that matter. So batteries are about 6 to 8 years behind solar in terms of its cost decline, but you're still seeing a pretty healthy cost decline on all of those. And you can see that when you look at where battery storage is starting from compared to where we are with solar, you see that massive drop down there on that bottom right. And even that one's a little out of date. I mean, we're now hitting electric vehicle batteries below $100 per kilowatt hour, which is a pretty phenomenal price target. Let us not forget about energy efficiency. The cheapest energy that we can generate is that which we don't need and we don't use, right? And if we think about putting people to work, and I talked about, not being able to outsource jobs in renewable energy efficiency, even more so, right? Because these are things that we can do across every single sector of our economy, and more people work in energy efficiency than all other clean energy technologies combined. We do have some good news that are happening globally and also in the United States. Electric vehicle sales are skyrocketing, mainly driven by Europe, but you're starting to see a pretty substantial growth here in the United States. So we're a good maybe 5 or 6 years behind where Europe is today on that graph in 2021, but we're hitting that peak of the graph going up, as well as some things as you see here with gas prices skyrocketing as well, kind of encouraging more and more people to go electric. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening in Alabama. Alabama Power's Plant Miller, just north of Birmingham, is the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the country. It has been for quite some time. So I show you two things here to show one from 2015 and one from 2021. That we haven't learned our lesson about greenhouse gas emissions. And just so you know, Southern Company plans to operate this plant at least to 2040 as of right now, if not later. So this plant is not scheduled to come off. And just a few days ago on the quarterly earnings call, Tom Fanning, the CEO of Southern Company, called this their, essentially their crown jewel of coal plants in the fleet. So they're very proud of this one, and they plan to run it for quite some time. As I talked about earlier, just because something is economic doesn't mean that that's what happens, right? Because we don't have a market. We don't have what most of us might think about when we say, hey, I want a new cell phone. I want to go buy a bag of chips or whatever. And I have a plethora of options and I get to make and pick and choose what I want to do. That's not how our energy system operates. And so as you may have heard over the last few years, Alabama Power has gone in for lots of new gas Even their own data has shown that the gas plants are wildly more expensive than the solar and storage projects that they proposed. But despite that evidence from the power company themselves, the commission denied all the solar and battery storage projects and approved the gas. We are currently involved before the Public Service Commission on another proposal from Alabama Power to buy even another gas plant in Calhoun County. We also do not invest or have any energy efficiency to speak of. You probably, if you've heard me speak before, say something to the effect of "thank God for Mississippi" is usually what most of us were raised in Alabama saying. And as you can see from this chart, it's going the other way now. Alabama has long underperformed every other state in the South. This is a study from the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy on how much energy we are saving as compared to the retail sales of a utility. When we don't spend any money or any effort on energy efficiency to help people reduce their bills, you can see that we have the highest electric bills in the country as a result of that. And you often hear, oh, Alabama's hot. Well, guess what? A, it's getting hotter. And B, we're not the only hot state. Look at our neighbors that have a good $20, $30 cheaper than we do. It's not like Louisiana is magically less hot than Alabama, or that Florida is magically less hot than Alabama. Is that their regulators, their commissions, their legislatures have forced utilities to take this into account. As a result of having pretty high electric bills, we have high energy burdens. That means that the proportion of our folks' income that are being spent on things like electricity and gas are some of the highest in the nation. And much like you heard Scott earlier say, who does that fall on? That burden will fall on low to moderate income households. And you can see those darker counties that are lit up. Those are going to be poorer areas of the state, areas of the Black Belt, and heavy minority population counties in Alabama. So those that can already least afford to pay for the bill and deal with the impacts of climate change are going to be the ones that are going to be facing this crisis of affordability on top of all of that. Again, we apparently make the news quite often here in Alabama for our accolades for how we rank energy efficiency. Many people may not know that Alabama Power is actually the most profitable investor-owned utility in the entire nation. They have a guaranteed 13% profit margin around that. It kind of goes up and down. But this is an article that I wrote for the Energy and Policy Institute looking at how much money they were making above and beyond what kind of the national average for profit margin for investor-owned utilities was. And it's a lot. It's a lot. You know, in one of the poorest states in the nation, we are essentially extracting that wealth from Alabamians and sending it to shareholders on Wall Street. We don't give our citizens much option or access to get to other alternatives. If you're unhappy with everything I just told you, well, good luck doing something about it, right? Because we're going to make sure that if you want to do something about it, we're going to tax you. We're going to make sure that it's so hard and so uneconomic, whether it be a tax or things like really poor buyback rates, or maybe just that you have no choices whatsoever for an alternative supplier, that those choices just don't exist, and you will love the bill that you will be forced to pay and have no other option there. Of course, all of those things taken into account, it's no wonder why even among our southeastern neighbors, we don't have very many homes with renewable energy. We don't have very many people who are working in the renewable energy field. And who can call this a good paying job and career because of the policies and the things that we have put in place to stop it. And here is precisely why. We have three large utilities, Power South, Alabama Power, and TVA, who are monopolies. And monopolies, just like any other monopoly or close to monopolies. I mean, I don't know how many people love American Airlines and their cable companies and cell phone providers, even though they're not technical monopolies, they're really close, right? And they all act very similarly. And this is the case with our electricity system, right? And so they have a vested interest to maintain status quo because, as I mentioned earlier, it is highly profitable for them to maintain status quo for as long as possible. And the people that are supposed to hold them accountable and represent the people's interests The Public Service Commission, which are elected positions in the state of Alabama, do not do their jobs. Yes, they are an elected, but it doesn't have to be this way. Our friends in Georgia, who are a lot like Alabama, have commissioners who have significantly increased the renewable energy output of the state of Georgia, one of the top solar producing states in America now. These are commissioners who are all Republicans, just like in Alabama. Georgia Power is a subsidiary of Southern Company, so they are owned by the same parent company. It doesn't have to be this way, right? And so I just show this to say that this is something that when I'm out in the community talking to people of all political stripes, we may have different incentives or different reasons why we want to act on clean energy, but the vast majority of Alabamians, the vast majority, not 70%, not 80%, but 90% and higher of Alabamians want to increase locally grown renewable energy. This is not a partisan issue at all. People want to see this because it is a lot of good stuff that can help for many areas of our state. We're also behind significantly on electrifying our transportation here in the state, but in a positive note, we are doing a good bit more on this front than we have been doing on things like energy efficiency and renewable energy. So we actually do have a Drive Electric Alabama push that you may have heard about. Governor Ivey kind of being active, a lot of manufacturing for electric vehicles coming to the state. We actually have an electric vehicle infrastructure plan. Can't get a water plan, can't get an energy plan, but we can get an EV charging plan. So I guess I'll take that when I can get it. Wish we could get some other plans for some clean infrastructure as well. But those are some good things that are happening. Remember, in order to solve this problem, we do have to electrify everything. And I mean literally everything. There cannot be the use of fossil fuels. We have to electrify everything and make sure that electricity is being generated cleanly. And in order to do even that, in a state like Alabama, where we have an elected public service commission and the legislature that works and deals with a lot of energy policy issues, we have to vote. We have to have folks in the legislature and in the Public Service Commission. Again, it's not a partisan thing. There are plenty of Republicans that I talk to who want to act on clean energy. We got to get the right people in office who are going to be able to take these issues seriously and move the interests of Alabamians forward. And that's all I have. Happy to take any questions.
All right, we have a lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to go back to Scott, the questions that were for Scott first. So I don't lose those because they're way back in the chat. And then we'll skip down to these others, and please continue to put your questions in there and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So there was an early question spot that was wanting to expand a little bit on the likelihood of more severe and drier weather, particularly drought. I know we've had a lot of rain for several years now since that 2016-17 drought. And you mentioned more severe weather, but maybe can you be a little more specific about what's what's on the horizon there?
Sure. So droughts are a natural phenomenon in the Southeast. In fact, mega droughts that last over a decade or multiple decades are natural to the Southeast. They're not many, but they have happened over historic time. The difference with climate change is that the models predict that we will get later this century more droughts than we have. So the drought frequency will increase and the droughts will be more intense and severe. So that 2016 drought, it came on the heels of record rainfall in December 2015. And then within just a few weeks, we were in drought territory. And that's the kind of quick swing that and the whiplash that we wind up having as we experience the weather as we leave behind a more stable climate and have a climate that's much more volatile. So in terms of droughts, yes, there's every reason that we should be preparing for more droughts in the future. The problem is, it's some years will be, we naturally have wet years, naturally have dry years, and then we get the droughts, and then we get the years with an amazing amount of rain like we had recently. Preparing for all of that is quite a challenge for a state that, quite frankly, doesn't put a lot of investment in resources and how to manage them and how to prepare for these kinds of things.
So along those lines, when we do have droughts, you mentioned the impact to our rivers and streams and the biodiversity from the low flows and completely dried up streams. And then, of course, we also see impacts to water quality from our high flows and the floods and all the junk that runs off of the land. So this is a bit of a loaded question that as when I ask it, but I'm going to ask it because Kathy asked it. Is anyone watching what is happening to the quality of water over time in Alabama's creeks and rivers? And of course, I don't know if she meant to just give a plug to river groups, which we have many on the call here, but also maybe answer that in terms of academia and agencies and where that data is it being gathered, where is it being held, and where people might access that.
Well, I saw that question in the chat, and I had already decided that the best person in the state of Alabama to answer that question is you, Cindy. So I really think that you should answer that because I can answer it partially, but you can answer it 110%.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I don't know about academia and exactly who all is doing that, particularly focused on that research. But I will, and most people I think know, but in case folks don't know, my organization is the Alabama Rivers Alliance. We're a statewide network of folks all over the state, from every little community, Friend of the Creek group to watershed scale waterkeeper organizations, the Cahaba River Society, Cahaba River Keeper, Black Warrior River Keeper, Mobile Bay Keeper. I believe our Choctawhatchee River Keeper is on the call as well. So there are definitely nonprofit advocacy organizations and data monitoring organizations all over the state that are taking in this information and putting it out there in various ways on their websites. And there's Alabama Water Watch, which trains and operates a citizen monitoring program and has for more than 30 years now over out of the University of Auburn, or Auburn University. I can't get that wrong, that's my alum. And they have a huge database on their website as well for the citizen monitoring programs that they've been operating for decades. And they have hundreds and hundreds of citizens that go out once a month. And mostly that's for baseline information of what's happening in a particular body of water over time. And when something spikes, if they test for chemical and biological, and when something spikes, then they look to see where the problem is. And same, I think, with the water keepers, if they're monitoring for some particular pollution or some particular industrial discharger, they're keeping that data all along. And so when they see a problem, whether it's a fish kill or a particular spike in some kind of pollution, a smell, some of that stuff you can see in the water, then they contact, or they look to see what the problem is, and they contact the authorities and or the industries and pursue solutions from that point. So that would be the answer to that question. And someone in the chat just put the word methane hydrates in there, and I don't know what that is. And I didn't know if that was a question.
So no, methane hydrates are basically when the temperature is warm in the ocean, and methane hydrates basically bubble up from the seabed. So that's a big deal on the global scale. But in a local scale, how can we equate the loss of habitat, which is a big concern of mine? And Scott and I were on a birding tour last week, which was great. Scott's unbelievable. So how do we touch the hearts and souls of the people in this state?
Well, I think
$1 million question.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that a lot of people on this call struggle with on a daily basis. And
absolutely.
I think what I find is that you have to meet people where they are. You can't start hammering people over the head with lectures and frankly, the type of talk that I gave tonight with lots of charts and graphs and stuff, and Daniel too, that worked for some people, but other people, their eyes glaze over. They can't look at that kind of thing, and they don't have the experience with it. They don't have the life experiences with looking at that. So you have to meet people with where they are, have to find where you got the shared values. So, talking to someone, fishing on the river, you start with that. And you can go in a lot of directions, from that. You talk to someone out on the trail, you talk to someone who's grumbling about their power bill. So you meet people where they are. That means that you have to be, if you're going to be an ambassador for the kind of changes that we need, you also have to be well-read and you got to know your facts, you got to know all your information, and you have to have that so that you can be confident enough to speak with, some authority. But you also don't want to be like, imposing and lecturing.
Shove it down their throat.
It's got to be conversations.
Right. And we have in Alabama the richest biodiversity probably in the nation. I mean, if you look at the watercress darter and all the efforts are being done, we have a great story to tell.
We do. And I'm going to get to some of these other questions in the chat if that's all right now. Thank you all for that discussion. And I'll put a plug in, Tim, if you don't know about Southern Exposure Films.org. It's a documentary film program that is tries to tell the stories of some of these issues in a way that might reach a broader audience as well. So I'll put a plug in for that.
Thanks for that.
And down to Daniel's questions for Daniel that started during his presentation. With the increased gas prices, will that make creating renewable infrastructure more attractive? And I'm going to assume that starts with that means in Alabama. And then maybe Scott's question is similar, but is the financing of existing coal and gas power plants one of the barriers to transition that investors want their return on the initial investment made many years ago? And that makes it difficult for utilities to shut down the fossil plants. So I guess those are kind of related.
Yes. So I'll take the first one. The first one first. I'll say that from a global perspective, from a European perspective, and from largely a US perspective, the answer is an emphatic yes. I think you're watching what's happening in Europe as they essentially are looking at completely getting themselves off of Russian gas in under 12 months, something that would have been previously completely unthinkable. Not even, you would have asked experts 6 months ago and they would have told you that is not technically possible. And now every engineer and every energy analyst in Europe is working overtime to get themselves completely off of Russian gas. So when you think about things like that, as well as these prices, I mean, just a simple like going out and trying to get prices for new power supply, yes, clean energy is going to look even more attractive, even though supply chain issues and inflation have hit renewable energy a little bit as well, not nearly to the extent that you're seeing with things like methane gas and what's happening in Europe. So it's going to make it more attractive. Now, specific to Alabama, much to what I mentioned earlier, just because it's even more economic, it's going to make it harder to deny that reality. But I don't necessarily know that under our current regulatory construct, without different regulators or people who will actually take that responsibility to the Alabamians' electric bill seriously, that those decisions will change. So I think you're going to see pockets of the United States where it's almost a defensive mechanism and leaning into fossil fuels or status quo just because. But I think largely speaking, you're going to see an even faster shift away from fossil fuels, which will, accelerate learning curves and price declines pretty. So it's going to be a nice feedback loop. On the second question, this is really interesting, and I'm going to throw a word out there that is talked a lot about in our industry called securitization. Essentially what's happening is that you're exactly right. Somebody's got to pay for these power plants. And in many cases, investors want their money back. If I gave Alabama Power money in 1985 and they promised this coal plant was going to run until 2030, I'm banking on this money coming in every year, just like you would for a mortgage until 2035. Securitization is essentially a way, and it has to be authorized by the legislature in many states around the country, including a lot of southern states. Just recently, this past year, North Carolina and South Carolina passed bills to do this, allows for that debt to be securitized and sold off as bonds so they can get it off of the utilities books faster and at a cheaper rate. And that's usually written into law in such a way to give at least some of the profits back to the utility company that they would have gotten, but not all, and some of the savings to ratepayers, to regular folks like all of us here on this call, so that there is some benefit to both parties for saying, okay, listen, this thing's not going to run until 2040 like we thought. Let's just figure out a way to get it off the books. We both take a cut, and then we have a whole pot of capital that we can now go redeploy into cleaner technologies. So you do see that policy being talked a lot about. If you're ever interested in that, if you just Google coal securitization, you're going to see a lot of literature out there about how to do that in a way that encourages more renewable energy development. And the same thing can be done for older gas plants that are reaching their end of life.
Great. So I'm going to jump ahead a little. There's some questions about the Public Service Commission. I'm going to hold those for a minute, but I do want to talk a little more about what they do and how they affect the entire state, since there is an election this year. But this one I thought was really interesting, so I thought I'd throw it out. Why is public housing not being targeted as a fertile or high profile market for renewable energy customers, since they could disproportionately benefit from lower utility bills and job creation? Is there anything like that going on in the state?
Yeah, this is a really great question. It's something that bugs me a lot. So there's three things that you need to know there. One is that unfortunately, it has been the policy of the United States to do energy policy via tax credit. So there's been some good to that, but there's also been some bad to that. And some of the bad to that is something exactly like this. If you do not have federal taxable income, you're an affordable housing developer or a nonprofit developer, you are a church, you are a school district, you are a local government, that tax credit is essentially kind of worthless to you. You can't take it. You need someone else or a private entity, which is why we push for a policy called third-party ownership that allows for that to take place. About 38 states in the country do allow for that. Or you need direct pay, which was going to be part of Build Back Better. It says we're just going to get rid of tax credits and we're just going to give direct grants to people what the value of the tax credit would have been if you're a nonprofit. So with affordable housing projects, many of them are developed by nonprofit housing agencies or nonprofit developers who can't take advantage of that. We do get lots of queries from people who want to do this, but it's hard economically when you lose 30% of what you were banking on in a project. Second, two things are related. One is that our energy code dictates all, I guess I'll say the standards for how the worst you can legally get away with building in the state, whether that be a single family residential home or a multifamily apartment complex or, a larger commercial or an industrial plant, as well as we also have what is called the Alabama Housing Finance Authority, which is responsible for administering things like the new housing tax credits and things like that that go for affordable housing. They have additional energy efficiency standards that go above and beyond the code. However, Alabama's affordable housing energy efficiency codes are like the worst in the country. We've been getting more active on that front, trying to raise those up. But affordable housing is not just about, how do I get the lowest rent? How do I get the lowest potential cost to get someone in a place, but also the cost of ownership or the cost of actually operating or living in that facility. So I know that was another long-winded answer for me just to say that those types of issues are typically addressed with the codes in the state, and we've really got to raise those up significantly to address them.
Okay, some great information. I'm going to mix it up a little and go back to Scott for a minute. There's a question about, could you talk a little about the changes to migration patterns due to climate change? And I'm not sure if that means human or animal, but maybe talk a little about both.
Sure. Those are both very different. Definitely globally, we're seeing people shifting where they're living for all sorts of reasons. Flooding issues, where you can do agriculture, that sort of thing. Here in the US, we're seeing some communities having to give up ground to sea level rise from Alaska to Florida and places in between. So that's definitely happening. In terms of migration, if we want to talk about in terms of birds, something I know a little bit about, actually a lot about for those of you that don't know me. Bird migration has been changing. There has been some detected shifts in the timing of migration. But even more interesting than that, for a lot of migrant birds, they're changing their body shapes. They're shape shifting. They're evolving to have smaller bodies because smaller bodies dissipate heat more readily. But because they're migrants and smaller birds are less efficient at migration than larger birds, birds are also evolving disproportionately longer wings. So the migrant birds that we're seeing today are shaped quite differently than they were, say, just a few decades ago. And part of me, when I first learned of that, was like, well, that's sad. I don't want my birds to change at all. But actually, when I reflected on it better, I realized that that's a good thing, because the bird species that are adapting and changing are the ones that are going to survive. So signs of change like that can be, and often are, signs of species that are going to at least make it through these first phases of the warming and changing climate.
So kind of on that same sort of nature-based information world, someone mentioned in the chat that young trees are not as good carbon sinks as old trees, yet we're continually seeing old trees being cut down because people are afraid they're going to fall in their house, or insurers fear the liability. Can you say a little bit about the difference between old trees and new trees when it comes to carbon sequestration?
Sure. When a tree is going through rapid growth, it's adding a lot of growth. Think of the cells that are being actually at the cellular level, the cells are larger. And so they're not storing as much carbon as periods of life when the tree rings, the annual growth rings, are actually happening more slowly, and the carbon is more packed in there. So you have to scale things again. You have to look at things like carbon per biomass of the tree over its lifetime. But even though, so the fact is, I think the question is motivated by pointing out the fact that older trees, we need to protect them and save them. I mean, they do tremendous things for us in terms of the ecological services that they provide. The services provided by a large tree are certainly way larger than that of a small tree, but we need to be planting the young trees, because all trees will eventually die, and we need to certainly have them replaced in the landscape. And in fact, we need to have many of our open spaces in the landscape filled with trees. Any places where trees grew naturally before, we should be planting trees now, as long as they're not a threat to people or critical infrastructure. We don't, for example, need to be planting loblolly pines next to houses anymore. With all the strong storms that we're having and all the houses I've seen smashed in Birmingham from these tall pines, there's places for those pines, but it's not in the neighborhoods. There's other trees that we should be planting instead. So yeah, there's a lot of science that needs to be done, and that has been done on trying to figure out right tree for the right place.
Great. So plant new trees, but don't get rid of new trees and old trees. We want both, right? So I'm gonna do a time check here. We got about 4 minutes left. I'm gonna throw out some Public Service Commission questions to you, Daniel. And then I'm gonna ask real quick before I do that, do speakers, Scott and Daniel, are y'all willing and able to stay on for a couple minutes later in case this takes longer, or do we need to cut us off right at 8? Can I get a thumbs up from Kathy? Can we do that if needed, a few minutes after?
I would love to hear the answers. That'd be awesome if they're willing to, if they're able to stay, and you are too.
Okay, so Public Service Commission, one question was about the difference, or a lot of people think Public Service Commission, they regulate the private monopoly of Alabama Power. TVA is set up slightly different. They're kind of quasi-governmental, but doesn't mean that the Public Service Commission decisions don't impact those in North Alabama that are on TVA. So explain a little about how those choices impact the entire state, those decisions that the Public Service Commission make and regulate. That was kind of the first question about the Public Service Commission.
Yeah, I think that there are 3 things that are relevant to remember at the Public Service Commission, even if you're local utility or your electric cooperative is not directly regulated by the Public Service Commission, which is the case not just in TVA world, but in other areas of the state, where you may have an electric cooperative or a municipal utility like Dothan, for instance. The first is that what happens in Montgomery will permeate through the rest of the state. We are looking at 3 local utilities here in North Alabama that one of which has told me straight to my face that we're looking at putting on a Alabama Power style solar tax because they did it. So why can't we do it? Right. Well, they're not regulated by the Public Service Commission, but they got the bad idea from the decision of the Public Service Commission. So those decisions that are made in Montgomery do have impact. These are entities that know each other. They talk to each other. They share ideas, good and bad. And so there are people that are looking at replicating those decisions, even if they're not directly related. The second thing is that the Public Service Commission does regulate things in North Alabama, just not your electric utility. They do regulate gas utilities, telecommunications, even things like Uber and Lyft are regulated by the Public Service Commission, interestingly enough. And so just because we typically think of like Alabama Power and the Public Service Commission, that's not the entire scope of the Public Service Commission's purported responsibilities. Railroads, it used to be some interesting things in railroads and traffic safety there. So those are really important things to people in Huntsville and Dothan and other areas that may not have an electric utility. And then the third thing that I'll say on this, while I'm preaching the gospel here, is that the decisions made in Montgomery, right or wrong, and whether or not they are regulated by the Public Service Commission, the vast majority of people and corporations outside of Alabama don't know that. I can't tell you how many times there have been large Fortune 500 companies who think that the Alabama Power tax is just something that happens all over the state. So the decisions they make are often travel and have impact well beyond our borders and impact people in Dothan, in Huntsville, and in Central Alabama Electric Cooperative, because people that are not from Alabama think that that's the way it is, and that that's the way it is everywhere in the state. So it's something to keep in mind. I mean, if you think about the way we do economic development, we hear that, right? We hear, well, I'm never moving to Alabama because that's Alabama. Same thing happens in energy policy.
So another question on the PSC was, do we think Alabama Power and TVA would buy green power from outside the state if it was cheaper? I don't know if that was PSC, but that was from Kathy. And they do buy some clean or different types of energy from outside the state, don't they?
Yeah, they
that's
do. But
what I thought they did. That's why I was asking is if they can buy excess energy when they need it, could they also just go out and buy energy if it saves them money?
in theory, they could, and they do some of that, like just a little bit. And it's usually for a corporate off-taker. So what that means is that usually a big company who has a sustainability goal says, I need to be 100% renewable energy or something like that. And then Alabama Power or TVA goes and buys the rights to some renewable energy, like wind power in Kansas or something. And then they sell those rights to that company so that they can claim they're powered by renewable energy. That's typically what happens. And it's a very small portion of what the utilities do. Especially for a utility like Alabama Power, they don't make money from those transactions. They make money, and the way that it is written in law for them to make money is to spend the money by building new generating and transmission assets. So they have to find ways to justify, i.e., not spending money on energy efficiency, but making sure that you need to build and buy lots of power from them, so that they can go to the Public Service Commission and say, well, Scott and Cindy and Tim, they just keep using more and more electricity. So we got to build this new natural gas plant. And when they get those types of things approved, that's how they earn what's called a return on equity. And that's really a huge measure of their profitability. So they make money based on how much capital they invest. When they do those types of things like buying rec credits or other types of things, you see them, that's usually just for goodwill or things of that nature, not really a profit center for the utility.
So we're at 8:02. There's several more questions. I haven't asked any of Nancy's yet, so I'll ask this one. Can you briefly describe, Daniel, how solar storage works? For those that may not be familiar with just the basic fundamentals of solar energy, what happens when it's cloudy or when it's dark?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so in the case of solar specifically, you know, as the sun comes out, you would have this, in a beautiful day, you'd have this nice parabola, right? Of as it gets warmer and the sun's out overhead, we're going to have a lot more production. And as the sun goes down, the production goes down. Wind is actually, at least for most of the US, pretty inverted to that, right? We actually have more wind power in the shoulders and in the evenings overnight than we do during the middle of the day. So if you kind of take those two profiles and put them together, solar and wind work pretty well together. So when you typically don't have a lot of solar resources, you typically do have a lot more wind resources. And then with battery storage specifically, is there are a few things that you can do. What you're kind of referring to there with that question, Nancy, is, you know, essentially arbitrage, where when I'm producing more renewable energy than I need during the heat of the day, I'm going to store that in a battery and then use it when the sun's not out, or when the sun's not out, but the wind hasn't kicked up yet. Those kind of shoulder hours, typically, right? When people are coming home from work and 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. type of time frame. So you can take that excess solar energy and use it somewhere else. There's a lot of other things that batteries can do. I won't bore everybody with all the technical things like frequency regulation that batteries can provide. But they are very versatile resources that help the grid work efficiently and reliably, even if they're not being all the time powered by renewable energy. So they're good for lots of things.
Okay, I'm going to say that we probably don't have time to get into some of these other questions. There's one about carbon credits, and I do believe there are some companies and nonprofits tiptoeing into that world, but I don't know enough about it to talk about it. And I also know that that's a controversial solution, so I'll just kind of leave that there. But I'll put a plug in for, it's not really necessarily carbon credits, but I'll put a plug in for Citizens Climate Lobby, who is doing strong national and state level efforts on looking at pricing carbon and different options for doing that in a fair and equitable way. So that's a group you can look up more information on pricing carbon. And unfortunately, we're just not going to be able to get to all of this, but there's a lot of organizations that have been mentioned. Tim, I see you have your hand raised. Do you have a quick question or comment?
Yeah, the quick question is, where do we stand on the lawsuit SELC versus Alabama Power?
That's in relation to the solar tax that is currently in federal court and awaiting a decision or some order from the judge. That order could be something as simple as, well, I want to bring you in for oral arguments. But as far as I know, everything has been presented to the court, and we're awaiting the court to take some action, whatever that might be.
Is there a timeline on that? I know it's hard to predict, but do we have any hope of getting that repealed?
No, the court can act kind of whenever and however it wants. It could act tomorrow. It could act, in 6 months from now. We don't know.
Gotcha.
So I know, I'm sorry. I know we have, I know we could go on talking about this all night, but I really want to thank our speakers for the great information that they have provided to us. There's also a lot of different websites. Kathy, I'm not sure if we send out a follow-up email with some links, but I hope that y'all were able to capture some of the information that was shared. There's Daniel's organization and all of Scott's different avenues for communication. I'm sure they'd be glad to continue to answer questions if you have them. So I'll turn it back over, Kathy, for you to close us out.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great education tonight on more insights into Alabama's, climate change and some of the energy issues that we have. And And I guess the main message that I think all of us can take away is that we need to be involved and we need to pay attention and realize that there's an election coming up in 2022 and another one in 2024. So it's important for us to start the top things you're learning here and the things that I know a lot of you are working on. We need to start asking our elected leaders as well as the people running for office how they stand, where they stand on these issues, and maybe start holding some candidate forums where we can ask those kind of questions. And Scott and Daniel, I'm very grateful to you and to Cindy. I mean, you guys are such a resource for us in Alabama. And thank you. And for everyone else, thank you for tying in with us. And Nancy Musis, our natural resources coordinator, she's been bringing us just so many different interesting programs. And I can't wait to see what the next one's going to be, because this has just been a really good opportunity for us. And thank you, everybody. And I guess I'll say good night. And we'll be putting this, I've dropped a link in the chat for the YouTube video, so people can start sharing that and just